I find the wide range of speakers on various topics, which are always of interest to historians and genealogists, is first class and a really great way to spend some time.
I come along to the meetings because I find the variety of talks at meetings interesting, always something of interest. Rarely do I come across a topic or a speaker that I don't particularly enjoy. And I like the social aspect as well. A couple of us go to the pub afterwards as well, so good night.
Person today, so we're ready for a fascinating lecture. Frank Tracy.
Thanks very much, Sean. If I appear to have a cold, it was I was told recently that I have perennial rhinitis, and I said to the doctor, "What's that?" He said, "A permanent cold." And I said, "What's the cure for that?" He said, "Always carry two hankies." That's the state I'm in now. But we're going to talk about the Masseys. I just picked one family. You have all these ascendancy people. I picked one family and I followed them right through. And the reason I picked it is because they had an estate up at the Hellfire Club. It's now called Massy's Wood. Very popular place for people walking around. But they had 3,000 acres up there in a big mansion. And I was a Boy Scout as a youngster. We used to go up there hiking and so on. So it aroused my curiosity because nobody knew anything about it. And we're going to be told this evening of a family that at their peak in the late 1800s had 4 mansions and 34,000 acres of land. And on the 15th of May 1924, the 6th Baron Massy was carried on his mattress down the avenue and, to put it in the vernacular, dumped on his arse out in the road. And that was the end of it. And he spent the next 38 years as an alcoholic in a little 3-roomed gate lodge up there. So we're going to go into how all that came about. The first thing to take note of, if this thing will obey, it was working earlier. No, if it doesn't, it just means I have to keep going back and forward. Bear with me for a second. I just take this out and stick it back in again. Knowing nothing about electronics, sometimes that works. But we did have it running earlier. Yeah, we'll just go on. Yeah. The first thing is the name, and they started off. I traced them back to Normandy, where their name was de Massy, D-E-M-A-S-C-I. And they came into England with William the Conqueror. And they knocked a few heads for William the Conqueror, for which they got half of Cheshire. Chester, Altrincham, all that area. And the greatest concentration of the name Massy in the world is in Cheshire. And they all emanate from there. So it became anglicised. They also got a title over there. It became anglicised into de Massy, M-A-S-S-E-Y, and then the D-E, as in a lot of these names, and here in Ireland, the D-E was dropped, and it became Massy. And then the man we're going to look at this evening, for some reason, when he came over with Cromwell, the name is spelled M-A-S-S-Y. And he and his descendants are the only branch of the family that spells the name that way. So people from all over the world get on Massy's through the publishers of the book I did on it, want to know who they are and where they came from. And the first thing I asked them is to spell their name. And if it's an E-Y, I say go to Chester. If it's an M-A-S-S-Y. And then more recently, since I wrote the book, I discovered another variation of it, M-A-S-S-I-E. Massy, and that will become important later in terms of tracing the particular man we're going to talk about. Okay, now the man who came in was Hamo or Hammon de Massy, and that name Hammon comes right down the family to the present day. The present family have that Christian name in it, Hammon, and they, as I said, fought the Battle of Hastings, and they fought in Cheshire. And they were awarded vast estates in Cheshire, and they set up an estate, Dublin Mountains in Cheshire. And 13 generations, each with the name Hammon, and with the title Lord Massy, lived over there. Dublin Massy changed into the female line, and then in the 80s was given over to English Heritage. And if you're ever in the Manchester area, it's just outside Altrincham, and it's one of these big estates like Parscourt, where you can go in and go around, and Dublin Massy. Now, the man we're looking at come over with Cromwell, and 1649, and there's the division of Cromwellian lands. England had no money. The reason why Charles the First lost his head is he had bankrupted the state, and then the parliamentarians under Cromwell took over, but they had no money. So Cromwell's army, he paid them in land. He just, depending on what you did, you got 1,000 acres or 3,000 acres or 4,000 acres or whatever. Now, all that meant to the peasantry, the previous landlords, who would have been mainly Anglo-Norman, you know, going back to the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers and all these people, they were all turfed out, and these guys put in. All that meant to the ordinary peasants was, instead of me paying him rent, I now paid it to him. Didn't make much odds at that level. So, one of the people who come over was Lieutenant General Hugh Massy, and he was commander of the horse, cavalry. And from the very beginning, the Cromwellians kept meticulous records. And from the very beginning, in all the Cromwellian records, his name is spelled M-A-S-S-Y. I don't know why, whether it's something he changed, whether someone made a mistake and he lived with it. It happens with my name. I'm T-R-A-C-Y. And if I go into a hotel or whatever and I say Tracy without a knee, the pen stops and you get this glazed look. And they will invariably put a knee in somewhere. They just can't hack it. So you have to say Tracy, T-R-A-C-Y. It did have a consequence later when one of my children is adopted. When we went through all that and I signed the forms, he said, you've signed it different to your marriage cert. Well, I said, my marriage cert is wrong. But then when we went looking at the children, they were all spelt all over the place, so we had to go through a whole rigmarole to get it all changed. Okay, now, he was allocated 3,055 acres in 3 locations in County Limerick, including Duntrileague, near Galbally, where he built his mansion. Now there's the original map of Duntrileague, okay? And there's the mansion, and over here you can see another building. That's a church. That's the mansion. The church is still there, the mansion is gone. But see the way they have all the fields named and divided up and so on. Now, I didn't trace a portrait or a picture of the first Hugh Massy, 1649. But I found a picture of Hugh Massy. Now they're all called Hugh, so this is the first dilemma. So I decided Hugh 1, Hugh 2, you see. So now we're on to Hugh 2. And we don't know his date of birth, but pre-1659, and we know he died in 1701. He trebled the land holdings. Now how they did that was, all Cromwell soldiers got land, but many of them didn't want land. They wanted to go home. So they started bartering between each other, you know, and you'd get the land cheap because all these guys wanted was to go home. And so this guy trebled the land holdings by buying from other Cromwellians. He built the church, and he's buried under the bell tower of the church. Sorry about that now, but now there's what's left of the church. There's the tower. He's buried under the tower of that. And that mausoleum, which we'll come to later, has 26 Masseys in it, spreading over about 50 years, and we'll come to that later. Now, his daughter, there was a bit of a kickback in 1690, which resulted in William of Orange coming over and finally sorting us out. But there was a bit of a kickback, and the Cromwellians, the women and children, many of them had to leave Ireland temporarily until all this was sorted out. And Hugh II's daughter was Elizabeth Irby. Now remember, she was only the 3rd generation, and she had married the minister of Duntrileague Church. And she fled to England, and when it was all sorted, she came back. And she gave this chalice to the church in thanksgiving. And the inscription is very interesting. This chalice was given by Elizabeth Derby to ye church at Duntrileague in the Kingdom of Ireland as a grateful acknowledgement to Almighty God for her safe return to her native country and finding her husband and father in good health, which mercy she hopes never to forget. Very interesting thing there. She's referring to her native country.
Yes.
Isn't that very interesting? That's the third generation. But I mean, the emigrants went from here to England. Like, I have nieces and nephews in England, and they see themselves as English. You know what I mean? And they have an English accent.
Settled in.
All the rest of it, yeah. They see themselves as English. So that still exists. Now, Hugh Tree was a bit of a bio. He was very much anti-papist, a rabid anti-patrist. He had a reputation for constant entertaining, gambling and duelling, mortgaged all the family holdings, they owed a fortune, and died in 1757 after a long, tedious illness. That's what the record says. So that's him now. I'm moving through these quickly because the interesting bit comes later. Now, the fourth fella was made a baron, and he became the first Baron Massy. And he was, the title was created in 1776. And he took this coat of arms, and you see the scroll, Pro Libertate Patria, for the freedom of our country. Of course, the problem he had, as with all the Anglo-Irish, what country? You see, what was he talking about? For the freedom of our country. But that's the Massy coat of arms. He built the next mansion. They're living in Duntrileague. He built Massy Lodge, and Massy Lodge is still there. And when things all fell asunder, that was a lovely house, and it was bought by a bachelor farmer. You wouldn't believe the state of it inside. Christ almighty, you know. The best of stuff, and he almost has pigs living in it, and cattle, you know. Terrible thing. But that was Massy Lodge. Now, the first Baron had a brother, Eyre, E-Y-R-E, and Eyre also became a lord. Now look at this fellow's career, and think of the time now. You're talking about the mid-1700s. He saw action in the War of Austrian Succession, 1740-48, the 7 Years' Wars, was with the forces that captured Portobello in Panama, was wounded at the Battle of Culloden. He was with the British forces that invaded Canada and captured Quebec. As Major General, he commanded the British forces in Nova Scotia. He was appointed Marshal of the British Army in Ireland and lived up there in the Royal Hospital in Kilmaine, and that's where the commander lived. He was created a Baron in 1800, taking the title Lord Clarina, and the title became extinct in 52 with the death of the 6th Baron Clarina and no male heirs. He changed his name back to EY. And the reason he did that was to distinguish himself from his brother. But because the title died out, it's not a problem. Okay? Now, second Baron is very important. The second Baron, as you can see, only had the title for 2 years. But the second Baron married an heiress who was an only child and inherited a vast fortune. And in the 2 years he cleared all the family debts. So we're now back in business again. The thing is to marry the right woman. That's now, the third Baron was there at the time of the Act of Union. He was one of the very few lords in the Irish Parliament who voted against the Act of Union. And he said, his speech is there, that they would rue the day. It would be the beginning of the end. Now it took a while, but it was the beginning of the end because Britain didn't give a fiddlers about them after that. And he built that charnel house, or the mausoleum, in Duntrileague. Remember I showed you the charnel house? And he's buried in it, and there's 26 people in all there. Now, he bought an estate in Castleconnell called Hermitage. He didn't build a house, the house was already there. He bought it and about 8,000 acres along with it on the banks of the Shannon. And that became the seat of the Massys. and they moved from Duntrileague to there. And Duntrileague gradually fell into disrepair. So they now have Hermitage and they have Massy Lodge, which was the one down in Tipperary. There's the mausoleum, and there are 26 coffins in there, Massy coffins. I don't know what's going to happen in the long term, okay? Now, I'll tell you a few little stories about them. Hugh Fitzjohn Massy. What would happen, you see, the secondary people in these families, the eldest got the title and the lands and all the rest. The other males had a number of options. They could join the army. They could join the Church of Ireland now, married them, do well in the church. And as time went on, they could join the colonial service. So that's where they headed off. So they had to find some other occupation. And this fellow, Hugh Fitzjohn Massy, found another way: abduct an heiress. And there's a book you can get in the shops, The Abduction of a Limerick Heiress. And it's a very nice story. You get it in the library, you get it in the bookshop. This Frances Inglesby was the heiress to a fortune, but she was a bit wayward as a young one. And she was sent down to an elderly uncle who was a vicar way down in the back beyond in Limerick. And Fitzjohn Massy arrived one evening with a few friends, and he knocked on the door, and he was in a dishevelled state, and he said he'd been thrown from his horse, and could he come in for a bit of refreshment. So they let him in, and his pals come in, and they ran off with the young one. And they took off initially down to Galbally, down to Duntrileague, and then they headed for France. And a warrant was put out for him with a vast amount of money on his head. Anyway, in France, she became pregnant and had a child, and then they came back to Ireland, and he was promptly arrested. Now, she now had a problem, because in those days, she was worthless now. She was used goods, you see, or wasn't marriageable. So she weighed it all up, and she refused to give evidence against him. So he got off. And they lived a nice life, and they had more children. So that was another way of doing it. Archdeacon Dirty Boots Massy, he was an archdeacon in County Limerick, and the deaconate of the cathedral in Limerick, St Mary's, was coming up, and he said he'd go for that job. And he hit off in the stagecoach for Dublin, and there was another clergyman in the stagecoach who was talking and said he was on the way up to Dublin to do an interview for this job. So Massy kept quiet, and when they got into Dublin, the other fellow went off to wash and polish himself, but Massy headed straight for Dublin Castle, because the church was a government department at that stage. And he went straight for the interview, dirty clothes and everything, and he got it. And as he was leaving, the other fellow came in to make himself, and the guy he met said, "Oh," he said, "we've just given the job to Dirty Boots now." He said, and he has the job. So from then on, he was known as Dirty Boots Massy, and he revelled in the name. Thomas Massy, see the play on the M-A-S-S-E-Y and M-A-S-S-Y. So he was in the Irish House of Parliament, and this story is in the records of the Irish House of Parliament. They were very, very Puritan, you know, wouldn't have a Catholic in the house and all this kind of stuff. And he stood up in the Irish House of Parliament one day, and he put a proposal that the term Mass be removed from the feasts Christmas and Michaelmas, and that henceforth the feast would be called Christtide and Micheltide. And the whole thing descended into farce when another member got up and said, "Why stop at that? Why not remove the term Mass from your own name and replace it with the word tidy, so that henceforth you could be known as Tom Tidy Tidy?" And that was the end of that. Never got anywhere. The Reverend Charles Massy was an old man, and he lived in Dunas House, which is down in Castleconnell across from a fine big house. And he married a very young and extremely attractive young woman. Never a wise thing to do, you see. And he was a friend of Lord Hertford, who was also an elderly man, white hair. This becomes relevant later, but with a lot more money than the Reverend Charles Massy, but Headford was a frequent visitor, and one Sunday when the Reverend Massy was off delivering service somewhere, the wife ran away with Lord Headford, okay, and a new crime had just come onto the books. Now the Victorians they were very squeamish about things, so they called this crime criminal conversation. And criminal conversation was having it off with someone else's wife, okay? And the first case of criminal conversation was the Reverend Charles Massy versus Lord Headford. And the court in Dublin was packed to the rafters with the ascendancy every day, and it went on. And Lord Massy's lawyer at one stage stood up and said about Headford, this hairy old creature whose snow-capped peak belied the fires that lay beneath. Isn't that lovely stuff? Anyway, Massy won his case in 1860 something, and he was awarded £10,000. You know, today you'd have to put an awful lot of notice onto £10,000. And Lord Headford on the way out said that was no problem. He had an income of 40,000 from his tents. Now, you can go into the National Library and you can read that whole trial. It's like a novel. You can read it blow for blow. The first case of criminal conversation in Ireland. So there we go. That's a few little side effects. So now we come on to the fourth Baron Massy. Remember, his father had moved the seat of the family to Hermitage in Castleconnell, and they had more or less abandoned Duntrileague, but they still had Massy Lodge. He married another cute man. He married Luke White's daughter Matilda. Luke White was the richest man in Ireland. It's felt he was possibly Huguenot. He might have been LeBlanc and became white. But he was a businessman. He wasn't ascendancy. He got the land through having money. Now he could go into, you can read his life, it's a separate thing you can talk about, but just for the purpose of this talk, because we're time limited, very, very rich man. So he married Luke White's daughter, only daughter Matilda. There she is there. Seems to be a nice woman. Now, there's Luke White. Okay. He owned places all over the place. Carry on. Now, Luke White built Killikee House, which was the house that was up the Hellfire Club. And a beautiful house it was. There's the one of only two photographs of the inside of it, so you can see, you know, extravagant. And when he died, he left that to his son Samuel. Now he had estates all over the country, but he left them to different members of his family. But Killikee and 3,000 acres in the house, he left to his son Samuel. Samuel's wife was huge into gardening and so on, and it's she who developed the gardens at Killikee. But they had no children, okay? And they're buried in front of the front door of White Church, Church of Ireland. You know White Church up there on the way up to Larch Hill? If you go out the two slabs there. And there's a huge marble memorial to them inside that church. And there's the front lawn of Killikee. We just flick through a few. There's the house, the fountain with Neptune, and there's the gardens. We'll just dwell on this for a minute. That's the only picture that exists of the gardens. And you have Turner Curvilinear Conservatories, a la the Botanic Gardens. There at the back. You have terraced gardens with lily ponds and fountains and all the rest of it there. Now, that's all in ruin. You come in there at the moment. You can see the boiler house at the back there. Okay. Now, after I finished the book, I was rummaging through the Irish Architectural Archive for something else, and up popped the drawing that Richard Turner did for getting the job in Killikee. That's what he submitted for the job in Killikee. So you never know what pops out of the woodwork. Now, Luke White left it to his son Samuel and his wife. They had no children, so when Samuel died, his wife had residence. She didn't live very long later, and it was left to his sister Matilda, who was now Lady Massy. And because in those days married women couldn't own property, it went to Lord Massy, the fourth Baron Massy. Now, just go back Shane, because if you can go back.
Previous,
Shane. Just go back. Now, there was another brother, Luke White Jr., who didn't marry, and his father left him 20,000 acres and a house up in Larreen, Kinloch, Loch Melvin up there, and he left it to his sister too. So now they're after getting 2 mansions, 20,000 acres up in Leitrim, and 3,000 acres in plus what they have. This is the only picture of that house, and that's the Drowse River, still the finest salmon fishing river in Ireland. Now, because you're into genealogy and so on, I'll tell you a little story about that. Okay. We were up, myself and my wife were up holidaying in Donegal, and I was immersed in all this at the time, and the first edition of the book had been published, but they were now moving into the second edition, and it was almost finalised. And on the way down I said to herself, I just want to divert in here. And she said, where are we at? I hope it's not due to bloody Massy, she said. So anyway, we arrived in. The house had burned down accidentally in the 1930s, but the outhouses were still there. And today they're turned into cottages for salmon fishermen from all over the world. Huge business, because the Masseys knew nothing about business. And but I wanted to see, was there anything of the house? So there was nothing in the house. And we called into a local calf there in Kinloch, and there was an old man in the corner, and I said to Bernie, he might, oh, for Christ's sake. I said, you never know, he might. So I went over and I knew all about the Masseys, blah, blah. I said, did you ever hear of a photograph of the place? Well, he said, there was a hotel in the village here years and years ago, he said, and on the cover of the menu there was a picture of Larreen House. And there's an old woman living up the mountain there now, and she worked as a waitress when she was a young one, and she might have a menu, you see. So I gave him my address and all that went off. Some months later, the second edition, and someone here has the second edition, because what I'm talking about is in that, but it's not in the first edition, was just about to go roll when in through the letterbox one day came a brown envelope. And I opened the brown envelope, and inside was an old menu with a little note in the box, sorry for the delay, sir. And there was the picture of the house. So I chased up to the printer. I said, have you started? He said, no. I said, is there anywhere in that book where there's a space? And well, at the end of that chapter, I said, put that house in there. So that's the only photograph of Larreen. And it shows you, you always keep rummaging.
Keep
you
your
never
ears
know
open.
how that came about. So there we are. Now, that man's son, the man who married Matilda White, he died in his 40s, which was sad enough. Therefore, his son succeeded at the age of 9 years. So really it was run by Matilda White. And this was through the famine. And because Lord Massy was dead and the new Lord Massy was only 9 years of age, she really had no involvement in the famine or evictions or anything like that. But one branch of the family, the Massy Dawsons, had a notorious reputation, infamous, in that they evicted in one day, and you'll get it under a book, the land clearances in Tipperary, the evictions at Tumavara. And he cleared out, the Reverend John Massy Dawson, cleared out the entire village of Tumavara in one day and demolished all the houses. One of the most infamous acts of the famine. Now, I'll tell you two stories about a man I get all these phone calls from all over, and this Mr. Tweedy rang me earlier this year, and he said his mother was a Massy Dawson, his grandmother was a Massy Dawson, and he didn't have the link, could have. So anyway, I helped him, told him where the graves were, told him where the house was, and all the rest. And I said, did you ever hear anything in your family about anything bad in Ireland? No, he said. Well, I said, just to alert you, because I said, I'm coming over to fish in the Blackwater, I was going to go up and see. So I told him where the graves were in the house. Now I said, your family carried out one of the most notorious and infamous acts of the Irish famine. And I told him, oh God, he said, would it be safe to come over? And I said, well, the only people that know that nowadays is a nerd like me. But I said, if you happen to be in the village of Tumabara and you needed a chalk ice or petrol, I said, I wouldn't mention the name Massy Dawson. But other than that, you'll be all right, you know. Now, he then told me something else, which I'll come to later. And he did subsequently come over and said he had a marvellous time. Everyone was very, very, very helpful. But interesting that the present generation of the family had no knowledge of that at all. Now, the fourth Baron, I told you, died in his 40s. His son took over at 9 years of age, and he died young. And now in the 1880s, his brother takes over at the age of 39, John Thomas. So for the first time, Lord Massy is not named Hugh, because it went from Hugh to the brother, John Thomas. And John Thomas loved being a lord. He absolutely loved it. And he inherited the Massy White Estates, 34,000 acres, Killikee House, Hermitage, Larreen House and Massy Lodge. And he thought the sun would never set on that. Now we go to the next one there. Now how the estates declined. You had all the agitation for land rights and so on, and Massy Lodge was besieged in 1881, and all the people there were totally surrounded by agitators and so on, and a troop of cavalry had to be got to get them out. And that had an effect on Lord Massy. It kind of upset him a bit, as it would. So then when the Land Act came along, this particular man, he'd nothing for or against tenants, he just regarded them as a nuisance. And he wanted to lord, and shooting, fishing and all that. So he was one of the first to sell off his land. He had no interest in the land as such. So he sold off the land in the early Land Acts. Now, the problem with the early Land Acts, for example, the first one, you got, whoever bought it got 2/3 of the price and paid back at 5% interest. The next time, it was calculated at 14 times the annual rent. They got 3/4 of the price, and that was the interest they had to pay back. The next one got 17, but right up to the Wyndham Land Act. And the landlord got 18 times the annual rent, plus a 12% bonus. The purchaser, the farmer, got the full price at 3% over 68 years, and they were queuing up to sell the estates. Couldn't get rid of them quick enough. Now what they didn't realise is the distinction between income and capital. When you sold it all off, you were now very rich, but you'd no income. You'd no income. Now the first generation, of course, had a great time. The next generation was struggling, and the next generation was wondering where the bloody hell it all went, like, you know, because there was no income coming in. And if you have a lump sum of money, and it has a life and it exhausts itself, and now the farmers, just a little story, they got from the British government, they got the money to pay for that, 3% over 68 years. When we got independence, part of the original Anglo-Irish agreement was that we would continue to pay the annuities, which the first government under Cosgrave, William T. Cosgrave, did assiduously. They paid it back. Then Dev came in and said, bugger that, we're not paying for what wasn't theirs to begin with, and he told them to bugger off. Now, but typical Dev, he still collected it. He just didn't pass it on. You know, and the British got the hump, and we had the start of the economic war, and that led to 30 years of absolute misery in this country, emigration, destitution, and still he was treated like as if Jesus had descended down, and the misery that brought. And when Massy came in, T.K. Whitaker said, this is nonsense, we have to sort it out. And one of the first acts he did was that Massy and T.K. Whitaker went over to Britain. Now at that stage with Britain, it was the principle. And it was all sorted for 10 million. And when you put that against the misery, the emigration, the destitution, there's that whole era has to be looked at objectively. Yes. Okay. Now there's Lord Massy on the right, and there's Colonel Charles Guinness, one of the Guinness family, to Braddon House, and they're still in to Braddon House there now. Now I found a load of photographs of Lord Massy. He was a kind of a dapper guy. In no photograph is he ever wearing the same clothes twice. Just carry on there. There's the 4 houses there. Now, we've sold off all the land. He got about, in today's terms now, he didn't get this much at that time, but the value of what he got in today's terms would be around 13 million. But he kept these 4 houses, and he kept the lifestyle, and he kept all the servants, and he was huge into shooting parties and so on. And we'll see all that. There he is with one of his daughters. Look at the cut of him again. And of course he would have been also keeping his sons and daughters and
incomes,
all the and his relatives and all the rest of it. Now he was huge into shooting parties. Killikee was famous. And there's a shooting party either coming or going. Okay, at Killikee. There's another one. Look at the cut of the staff. Now there he is there. Okay. And all these, yeah, you move on to the next one then. All these shooting parties here. And there he is all dressed up again. And look at the carriages. And there he is again. Look at the cut of the staff. And so on. And they go up the featherbed shooting. See that fella there? That's Lord Cloncurry. And his estate was Lyons. Tony Ryan took over Lyons. And Lord Cloncurry, I reckon, was the original Have Gun Will Travel, because I have looked through hundreds and hundreds of photographs of the ascendancy, trying to trace Massy photographs. And in shooting parties all over the country, Lord Cloncurry is there. He seems to do nothing else but shoot. And he was the bane of chambermaids. Not for the reason you might think now. But that beard, which you saw there a minute ago, he dyed it mauve, in God knows what. But he left a trail of mauve bed linen everywhere he went. There they are up on the feather beds there, look. Lovely life, isn't it? Relaxing. Now one of the great features of Lord Massy, there he is there, look. And when I do walks of Massy, the Massy estate, I can stop at that exact spot there, okay? And look at the gamekeeper and the cut of him up there. And one of the great features of going on a shooting party in Lord Massy's is that you dined al fresco in the woods after the shooting party, look. And all the silver come up and all the things. And there they are there. And then you see the women would come up, you never know, you might catch a man. And there's the carts that they come up in there. Then he had house parties. Here he is here. These are his daughters here. And now in all of these photographs he had one son. His son doesn't appear, and that becomes relevant later. That's Killikee House. And now there's Hermitage. He would stay in Killikee for the shooting season, and they would shoot all over the featherbeds, and then they would move like Fawcett Circus down to Castleconnell for the fishing season down there. And he would hold big parties and fetes and all the rest of it. And there's the house, there's the Shannon. It was the finest fishing spot on the Shannon. It's all destroyed now because of the ESB, the power. But it was said that in season, you know, the way the salmon come up, there were rapids at Castleconnell, and they would wait to go up the rapids. It was said that the amount of salmon was such that in season you could cross the Shannon at Lord Massy's by walking on the backs of the fish. Okay. There they are now, out on the Shannon, fishing there. Look at that, I don't know what he has, but it's something big. But you see the next one now. Look at that salmon. Such a fish doesn't exist now. Well, I smile at those, the cut of the poor devil, look. I don't think he saw much of the salmon. Now, then, at the age of 70, you can see the money going now, you know. At the age of 70, he discovered cars. And he got a fleet of cars. Now, what I did discover, why is he spending all this money and so on? He had one son, he fell out with the son. I never got to the exact reason. I think it might be the woman he married who was a bit of a tartar and he couldn't stand her. But he fell out with the son, and you don't see the son in any of the things. So he didn't have any conscience then about spending the money. So there's one of his cars up there. There's his limo, look. The 62nd car in Ireland. See the chauffeur? And that's up at the Hellfire Club there, you know the road going up? There, that's there. And then he got a marvellous idea. He said all this horses and carriages and all the rest were going on the shooting parties. And he bought a Charlemagne. 1909, imagine that going across the featherbeds in 1909 and the devils big and tough. Marvellous idea, look, there he is there, look at my Charlemagne. The cost of running all this. Then he was there for the coronation of Edward VII in 1902 and he got himself all dickied up for that. And he did an interview for the Irish Times on his 75th birthday. He predicted that there would be a civil war in Ireland, but he thought it would be between the Unionists and Republicans. But we didn't do anything as sensible as that. We had it between ourselves, you know. He was gone with that next one there. Now, on the 28th November 1915, he died at Killikee. They hired a full train to bring his coffin down, the whole lot down to Castleconnell, and all the lords and all that were there. And there's his grave there. He's buried in there with his mother and his grandson. We'll come to that later. There's the church there, which they paid for. That's across the road from the Hermitage Estate in Castleconnell, and the Massys paid for that. And that church is awash with Massy memorials. Now it has a feature that you have a long, not a big church, Church of Ireland, with a balcony to the side, okay? And that was known as the Lord's balcony. And that was carpeted and had a fireplace in it. And on Sundays, some servants would come down from the house and set a fire there and so on. And the Massy family would arrive and they had their own private door in. And the congregation would be all waiting there. And when Lord Massy appeared on the balcony, they'd all stand up and he would nod. And he would sit down, get a blanket over him, tap the floor, and the service began. And when the service was over, he'd go to the front of the balcony, nod and so on, and then he would leave and nobody would stir until the Massy family was gone. I gave the talk in the church one day, you see, so it was extra fascinating for the locals because I could point at the tablets and say, that's your man and that's your man. Anyway, a new vicar came at one stage and his sermons got longer and longer and longer. So Lord Massy had him up to tea and told him this wasn't on, his lunch was at such a time and getting delay. And your man said, well, I'm sorry, my lord, but I get carried away. And Massy said, well, you have to try and keep track of time. Yes, my lord, and so. So about 6 weeks later, a clock about that diameter appeared at the end of the church. And to this day, that clock is known as the Lord's clock in that. So he gave your man the message, keep an eye on
2 minutes
on the clock. There. Okay, so now he's dead, and there's his son. Now when they came to read the will, not only was all the money gone, but he had mortgaged all the houses. So they were broke. They were broke. He obviously didn't care about the son. Now, the son was a bit of a gambler, a drinker, and he probably just saw him as a bloody waster, like, you know. And this can happen in these ascendancy families. You see, the Queen lasted long enough, and Charles got a bit wayward, but he seems to have come back in line Yeah, but there's a good chance he'll die before she does, the way things are going. He's 70 in a couple of weeks. Okay, we just go on there. There's the wife. Now, I've read some articles about her, and she was a woman to be feared, like, you know. To put it in the vernacular, a thundering bitch. You know what I mean? And the local paper, she was always suing this one and suing that one. She sued the local superintendent, this, that and the other. A woman to be avoided. Now, there, her name was Wise, Ida Wise, and the Wises owned property down in County Tipperary, Ardfinnan, and they had a dower house, and her husband and herself were living in the dower house of the Wise family. They didn't live up in Killikee. It doesn't seem to have appeared in Killikee. There seemed to be fierce tension there. Next day. But
Sorry.
we're going backwards.
No.
Around again. Now there she is with her two sons, and Hugh is the one standing up, and Tristram is the one sitting down. And they had 3 daughters. But you can see, even looking at her there, she was a formidable woman, you know. And carry on there. There's where they were living, the dower house in Ardfinnan. Now that becomes very important later, because that's not a Massy house. That's a Wise house down in Tipperary. Now, just go back for a second. If you look very closely, you'll see there's 2 people there, one of the girls, and probably a teacher or somebody. But it was quite a substantial house. That's a farm now. Okay. Carry on. So now, they're broke. The old man is dead. So they put Castle Connor and the contents up for sale. It took a week to sell the contents. And that would have given them money to last for a while. They couldn't sell the house. There was no, who would buy? You know, it had 36 bedrooms in it. So just go on there. There's her daughter, Lillian Iron. Now, I would be a very good friend of Lillian's son, Tony Massy Brown, through the writing the book, and he died there 2 years. One of these strangeness of fate. He died in England, and I was invited to give the eulogy at his, and I gave the whole history of the family and so on. And friends of his come up and said to me afterwards, "We thought he was spoofing." I said, no, he wasn't spoofing. Christ, I said, no. Anyway, Lillian was a bit fiery, and she's the daughter of the man down in Ardfinnan. And he's the 7th Baron. Now, they were down on their uppers, but in those days they had to put a good front, you know what I mean? And he was banned from driving because he knocked a young kid down and killed him up in Killiney, and he got off, but he was banned from driving for a while. So they used to hire cars, and they used to hire cars from Clonmel, kings of Clonmel, and the son would be sent out with a car. So Lillian fell for the son, okay? And one evening, Lillian and young King eloped, gone. And word went out for them. Now, somewhere along the way, he was Catholic. A Catholic priest married them, okay? But then they were caught getting on the boat at Holyhead and brought back. And Lillian maintained that she was brought out to the stables and horsewhipped, sent up to her room. King was dispatched, and he ultimately went to Wales, you see. And Lillian kept saying she'd find him and she'd go and find him and all the rest of it. Lord Massy brought in the 2 Church of Ireland and the Catholic parish priest and vicar and so on. And on the kitchen table, the marriage was annulled, just didn't exist. No records, gone. And people in Ardfinnan to this day refer to Lillian as the woman who married for a day. You see? Now, she still kept saying she was going to find King, so they looked up all their relatives, and they dispatched her to relatives in Australia. Now, this is in the early 20s. And 8 years later, she came back, but it was all gone by then. You know, the mother was dead, and the father was alcoholic and all the rest of it. So there was nothing there. So she went back to Australia, and on the boat she met one of the officers, and Tony, her son, would say to me, on the way back she met my misfortunate father. And she wove her way around it. But Tony would say, even though they didn't have much, they were okay, but the father was an officer on the ship and so on. She would always refer to him as the child, in third party terms, the child. And he always had a minder, whatever they call him, minder. And he said even though she'd nothing like, they'd go somewhere and she'd get off a train, and the first thing she'd do was, Porter, Porter. It's just never. And you wouldn't be 10 minutes with her, but you would know she was Lord Massy's sister, like, you know. And of course, next question was, who's Lord Massy, like, you know. But she maintained that till the day she died. They had a very, very poor relationship. She retired, she got cancer, and herself and the husband retired down to Clonmel. And she was buried in an unmarked grave in Clonmel at her request, because at that time people believed that the ascendants were buried with their jewels and all the rest. And a lot of graves were being dug up and all this. So she insisted in an unmarked grave. But he had very bad relations with her, and it affected him all his life. But as a man in his 80s, he came over to stay with me. We went down to Clonmel, and his wife Hazel, who's still alive, was with us. And she had spoken to me, and I said, will we do something? So she got flowers, and we went into the graveyard there in Kilsheelan. And I said, you remember where she's buried? He said, she's buried over there, and so on. So I said, look, we'll stay here, take the flowers, go over and make your peace with her, put the flowers there, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And it was a very emotional moment, so he never went back, but he died there last year. So that's Lillian. Now, that man in Ardfinnan, he died in destitution in Ardfinnan, and when the revenue man went in to see for debt duties and so on, said that the furniture, everything was burned. Now, just to fit in, before that, his wife died suddenly. Ellen died, the woman, she died suddenly, and she seemed to be holding the whole thing together. And when she died, your man fell to bits, took the drink, and so on. Now, his eldest son, I showed you her with the two sons, Hugh and Tristan. This is Hugh, and the grandfather was still alive when Hugh had his 21st birthday. He had aspirations to being Lord Massy, and here he is in Killikee on his 21st birthday, and the world looked all great, but none of them had any idea that the grandfather had blown all the bloody money. Now, Hugh married Margaret Morden. That young lad, he became an alcoholic, and the family blamed the butler in Killikee for throwing drink into him. And he was in drying out in Mercer's Hospital. Mercer's was the Protestant kind of hospital. And he met a nurse, Margaret Morgan, who was a young widow with 3 children under the age of 5, and she was the widow of a doctor. Now, he was a very handsome guy, but whatever, women make these bloody stupid mistakes at times. She decided to marry him, you know, love, so whatever. Anyway, she married him, and there's the marriage notice. And his family, she was Catholic, he was Protestant. His family told him that if he married her, they'd never talk to him again. And they didn't. So he married her, and the two of them moved into Killikee House, and the rest of the family are down in Ardfinnan. And then the family take the decision to sell Killikee and the contents. And that took another week, selling off. But see, that would only keep them going for another while. Now they have Hermitage empty. They're now empty in Killikee and selling it off, but he's in there with the wife. And then they had one child, Hughie, and she had 3 children from the first marriage, but we'll see what happened to them afterwards. Now the War of Independence comes along, and the Hermitage in Castleconnell gets burned to the ground. Now I discovered why that happened, because things were very bad in Munster during the War of Independence, and the IRA were on top of things there. So there was a little snippet in the Limerick Leader saying that reinforcements were being brought in from England to land in Limerick, and they were going to bill it in Lord Massy's empty house in Castle Connell. Well, that was the death sentence for that house. So the house went up. Now, leave that there. Lady Massy took the husband was an alcoholic at this stage. She took a case against the Limerick County Council for the burning of her house, and they told her to bugger off, because at that stage they had the Sinn Féin majority, and there was no way that those who burned it down were going to give her money for it. So she took a garnishee. That's an interesting thing. You owe me money, but you won't give it to me. Okay? And I discover that you owe him money. So I garnishee that money. And instead of that money going to him, it comes to me. And she took a garnishee against the Great Southern Railways. She discovered that Great Southern Railways owed a big amount of money in rates to the Limerick County Council. She went to court and she was awarded the garnishee. But it was about 2 months before the first Anglo-Irish Treaty, which established the Irish Free State. Okay? So they just held fast, and then the Anglo-Irish Treaty came in, and part of that was that the incoming administration had no responsibility for liabilities entered into by the previous administration. Now, she won the award under an English court, and now they were gone. And so she never got the money. Never got it. Now, an interesting side about that, when I traced her family, the Wises in Ardfinnan, they knew, she used the phrase, I'm trying to think of her name now, but she said to me, oh, she was a thundering bitch, you know, she caused a lot of trouble in this family. My mother was alive, she'd tell you all. Oh, yeah, and so on. And I said, I have her will. Now, she had been awarded £30,000, which was a huge amount of money, you see. Now, at that stage, I didn't know that she hadn't got the money, because I got as far as she was awarded 30,000. And I said, she left the 30,000 in her will, you see. And she said, did she now? The bitch, she says. And who got that? I said, I don't know. I said, oh, she says, if my mother was alive now. And she said, are you likely to find out? I said, I'll find out. You must come to tea, she said. Anyway, in the end, I had to tell her it was all a puff of smoke, you know. And Yvonne McClintock was her name. But anyway, so they never got any money for the house in Limerick. And this all led, like he was an alcoholic, she suddenly just died at the age of 54. I've no evidence of anything, but I think it had reached a point. They were penniless, the shame of it, you know, the whole thing, I don't know, but she just suddenly died. And I can't find a grave for her, you know. And then not long afterwards, because he couldn't cope, he died of alcoholism, you know. Now, the son, who's now Lord Massy, is up with his new wife and the children up in Killikee. The mother dies, carry on there, and he's in the house in Killikee. And then all this money is owed. There's no way of paying it back. He's an alcoholic. And on the 15th of May 1924, the bailiffs arrive. He's in the house with her and her 3 kids, and they now have 1 kid themselves, Hughie. So he took to his bed, he's only in his 30s, and announced that he was not a well man. And the bailiffs came in, and he made this grand announcement, I shall not be leaving this house until the day I'm carried out. And they said, right, my lord, and they picked up the mattress down the avenue. Do you know Timber Trove Cafe up there? Just outside the door there. The woman that lived at there, when you go in Timber Trove, you look around, there's remains of a little gate lodge there, Mrs. Reed. She took in Mrs. Massy and the children, but she wouldn't have anything to do with him. There was no great regard for him. And the Foxes, who were the stewards, which is up in what is now called Killikee House, but it's not Killikee House, where the stables were. The Foxes took him in. Representations were made on their behalf, and eventually it was discovered there was an empty gate lodge, even then in a decrepit state, 3 rooms, clay floor, no toilet, no running water, and they gave him that. And he lived in there for the next 38 years with Margaret Massy. So she's the hero of the piece. They couldn't keep all the children. Her family from the first marriage took the children from the first marriage and reared them. And Hughie grew up in Killikee. He went down every day to where the Mary Ploughboy is now. And he took a string. At one stage, some relative, distant relative, left him £3,000, which was a lot of money, you know. And reporters went up. He was always giving interviews with lots of bits in the paper. He was a bit of a character. And asked him how he felt about the 3,000. And he said, "I can't remember the man," he said, "but I'm jolly glad he remembered me." You see? So I don't know what they did with the 3,000. She rolled up her sleeves. Women tend to be very practical in these situations. And she got the bus 47 into Ballsbridge, and she got a job in the Irish sweepstakes. And she worked until she retired, mixing tickets and all the rest. And she was known in there as Mrs. Massy and greatly respected. He did nothing. Sat in the cottage, drank, walked around.
What is there?
Well, I'd say he was clinically depressed, and nobody gave a shit about him. And Joan O'Kelly, who's up there, she's the matriarch of O'Kelly's there, the wood people. And Joan knew them well. As a teenager, Joan used to help Miss Massy dilute the whiskey and keep an eye out the door, see he wasn't around, and generally help about. And he had been educated in Harrow, so he had this Harrow accent, you know, beautiful. And I said, "How would you describe him, Joan?" "Oh," she said, "Frank was a lovely man, very gentle. He wore the Trilby hat, and he had a trench coat, which was a great trench coat in his day, but it wore into tatters. We'll see it in a minute. And he'd say, 'Good morning, ma'am,' to you, and he loved you to call him my lord," and so on. She said, "Lovely." You'd talk to him just to hear the accent, she said. "Lovely, gentle fella," she says, "and fucking useless." So that was her assessment. How she stuck with him, it says, I don't know. But she did. Love, funny thing, she stuck with him till the end. And she wouldn't hear anything bad said against him. So there he is there now. There's the little cottage. They spent Beehive Cottage. It's in the shape of a beehive. And they spent their last days there. And his father died. We spoke about that. So we'll carry on. Father died there and that. And there he is there. He's a fine looking man, wasn't he?
Is that the one down
He's the
the
one
Cruise
married
graveyard?
Mrs. Morgan. Yeah. And now his grandfather was the man who blew all the money. He's buried down in Castleconnell and so on. We'll come to this man later. So there he is, up there, and he spent a lot. Now, there's the trench coat and the Trilby hat. He was always giving interviews. Keeps house while his wife works, £2 a week peer. He's known as the penniless peer. And then she started then to get a bit of income. Even then, that area was popular for hiking. So she'd work all week in the sweepstake, and then at weekends she'd put tables and chairs out in front of the cottage, and she'd serve teas, coffees and scones. He did nothing. Nothing. And like, instead of keeping his mouth shut, reporters would turn up in the pub and talk to him. Okay. And there's the house in its last days. The bank took over the house 15th of May 1924. They put a caretaker in it. They held it until 1941. Couldn't get anyone to buy the house. And then they sold it to a kind of a scrap person, you know, one of these. There was lead on it, there was Welsh slates, there was the best of timber, floors, stairs, statues, you name it. And he stripped the whole house, and then he demolished it. 1941. And that's it in its last days. A woman came in to me at one of my talks and said, "Frank, is that Killikee House?" And I said, "It is." And you can see from that the roof is gone, and see the sandbags and so on. And see this group here. Well, I went to the Army Archives, and what that is, 1940, that's a new platoon of the LDF. Dad's army. Okay? And they used Killikee for training. See it there? It was empty. Sandbags and so on. And you see the Captain Mannering here. See that? That's Kathleen Watkins' father. Gay Byrne's wife. That's her father. And most of the rifles are timber. They're not rifles at all. So that's Dad's army, 1940, up at Killikee House. So you never know what pops out of the woodwork. Now he would go down to the pub, and Joan O'Kelly says to me, oh, he'd come back, Frank, staggering up the fields, and he'd sit down. And she said, he had a saying, I can't remember, he said, if it comes to you, tell me, you know, about it, Joan. So she rang me one night, she said, I remembered it. I said, what is it? She said, he'd sit in the log and he'd say, Joni, if those trees could speak and those mountains could see, many a tale you would hear. Everything he looked at, he owned at one stage, you know. And he'd stagger up to the house, and he said the wife, she never gave out to him. She'd come out and say, oh, Hammond, look at the state of you. Come in here and I sort you out. And so on. Okay. So there he is through his life, 21st birthday. That's his marriage photograph. That's in midlife, and that's towards the end. And you can see the decline there. Okay, there he is with his son, Hughie. And the people I'm in touch with now are Hughie's sons in England. Hughie left in 1941, there outside a little cottage, in the middle of the war. He joined the British Army. He never told them who he was, because if he did, he would have been an officer straight away. And he served throughout the war as a private in North Africa and the Middle East. He met an Irish girl there, Margaret Flower, a nurse, and they married and settled down in England after the war. Then he died 20th of March 1958, and he expressed a wish to be buried with the grandfather down in Castle Connell. Margaret, the wife, was a Catholic, and she was a very fervent Catholic, up and down to Rathfarnham to Mass. In his will he said, I desire to be buried in the family vault at the graveyard attached to Castle Connell Parish Church in the county of Limerick, and I desire that the funeral service be held in that church. Well, she said to herself, yes, she'd bury him there, but there was no way he was going into a Protestant church, and that was the end of it. So she had a mass held in Rathfarnham, and the hearse went down to Limerick, and they got a couple of lads who were building a house nearby to help them to open up the vault. It's a vault that's under that, and put the coffin in the vault. And when I went down to check all that out, I spoke to lads in the local history society, and they said, well, we're fairly sure he's in there because there's no inscription. And I said, is there any way you could verify it? And so we'll leave it with us. So they came back about 4 weeks later and said, oh, he's in there all right, and so is his father, and so is his grandfather and grandmother, and some other Massy fella and so on in there. And I said, well, are you sure about that? And they said, would you like to see the photographs? I said, what do you mean the photographs? They said, well, we tapped all around it, and we discovered just down there was a hollow thing. So we cleared the grass, and there was a slab, and there was stairs down. And we went down to this rusty lock on the door, and we decided it needed changing, so we gave it a whack with a crowbar, and we went in, and we photographed the plates on the coffins, and we come back out again. So there you are now.
Okay.
There's the wife. She was the hero of the thing. After he died, she sold the cottage, and she moved over to live with Hughie in England. And she spent the remainder of her days living with Hughie in England. And her grandchildren, who are the present family in their 60s now, they say until she died, she spoke not one word about Ireland. And she told them not to go there, never to go back to it, and they could never find it again until I brought them up and showed them that's it there. Now, so that's Hughie, her son. Then, when I found the family in England and so on, Hughie's daughter, Hughie had lived all his life in England, he had served in the British Army during the war and so on, and nobody ever knew who he was. Okay? and he had one daughter, and she brought me up to the local graveyard, and she said, I decided that he would have in death what he never had in life. And the grave says, the Right Honourable the Lord Massy Huey. There. So I decided that full circle, you know what I mean? Back. So just go another one there, we've about 3 more. There's the present lad David. He's Huey's eldest son. And when the book was launched, he came over and was given the first copy of the book. It was launched in the National Museum, and the people down in Massy Lodge gave him a drawing of Massy Lodge. See it there? Now, and the next one is very interesting. It's the final slide. I get calls from people all over to the who are we and so on. Now, remember I told you about the man, the Massy Dawsons and so on, and he was Mr. Tweedy. Now, because all the stuff, the records were burned when they burned the house down in Castleconnell, very hard to get stuff. And I always asked them when they ring, have you any stuff, have you any Massy stuff? So this Mr. Tweedy rang earlier this year, and I says to him, have you any stuff? And he said, I've only the one thing. And I said, what's that? He said, I have a portrait of the original Hugh. I said, the Cromwellian, 1649. He says, yes. I said, how did you get that? I don't know, he says, but it's always been there. And I said, would you send that to me? And he did. And I said, how do you know it's him? He says, it says it on it. Colonel Massy, now we'll come back to that in a minute, appointed Lieutenant General of the Horse for Ireland by the Parliament. I can't forget what that word, I know what it is, but raised for Ireland, for Parliament. So that's the original Hugh Massy. Now, a very interesting thing, the name is spelled M-A-S-S-I-E. So he didn't change from M-A-S-S-E-Y, he changed from M-A-S-S-I-E. Now that helped me go back to the records, because it's never been worked out where exactly he came from, because the Massys are all over Cheshire. And there was one family from Coddington that spelt the name M-A-S-S-I-E. So I think he came from the Coddington branch of the Massy family in England. So there you are. That's it.